Coming up, Richard Trudell reflects on his legal career in service to Indigenous people over 4 decades. Plus politics with John Tahsuda. I'm Mark Trahant. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian Country Today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. The White House is releasing a new plan to fight the coronavirus. On Tuesday, President Joe Biden said the government will provide 500 million free rapid tests. It will also increase support for strained hospitals and will double down on vaccination and boosting efforts. The plan comes as experts predict a winter season of increased case numbers. On Monday, officials declared the Omicron variant the most dominant version of the coronavirus in the U.S. Biden urged many to get their booster shot, with early data showing that the vaccination offers strong protection against severe illness and death in Omicron.
Over 60 million Americans, including 62% of eligible seniors, our most vulnerable group, have gotten their booster shots. I got my booster shot as soon as they were available. And just the other day, former President Trump announced he had gotten his booster shot. Maybe one of the few things he and I agree on. People with booster shots are highly protected. Join them. Join us.
Everyone who is 18 or older can get a booster 6 months after getting a second dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. The White House said it will launch a new website in January where Americans can order a rapid test and get it shipped to them for free. In South Dakota, the Ogallala Nation is dealing with the legacy of a former Indian boarding school in its territory. ICT producer and correspondent Vincent Moniz has this special report.
At the Red Cloud Indian School, students in grades 3 through 5 are learning about the history of boarding schools across North America. Generations of Indigenous children were made to sever tribal bonds while being forced to assimilate into white English-speaking Christian culture. Decades ago, the boarding school, known then as Holy Rosary Mission, was staffed by Jesuit priests and Franciscan nuns. Red Cloud Indian School has boarded Native students for nearly a century after its founding in 1888. Its current name comes from the Lakota leader who fought against illegal U.S. land grabs before his people were forced onto the reservation. Randy Lynn Boucher Gallego, a teacher at Red Cloud, reminds students why they are able to practice their traditions in spite of the traumatic history.
You speak Lakota, you sing in Lakota, and you're able to do that because your grandparents had suffered, but now you're turning that around. So today's lesson is really about that and what the people have endured, but also having them understand their own resiliency.
While Lakota staff, language, and ceremony are central to Red Cloud, the 133-year-old school has never fully reckoned with its beginnings. The school is now undertaking what it calls a truth and healing process. Tashina Banks-Rama, Vice President for Advancement at Red Cloud, is working to open the school's archives as a way to face the past.
The work of opening records and giving family access to information is critically important for families to move forward so that they can understand their own history and determine their own, how they use that for their healing.
The healing process, which began in 2020, is following 4 steps described as confrontation, understanding, healing, and transformation. In Bismarck, this is Vincent Moniz for Indian Country Today.
In Alaska, the Aleut community of St. Paul Island is proposing a new initiative called the Pribilof Islands Marine Ecosystem Prime Initiative. The goal of the new sanctuary is to provide a space for commercial fishing and fur seal. The island is experiencing an alarming decline of fur seals, sea lions, seabirds, fish, and crab. Director of the Office of Justice and Governance, Marissa Marikloof for Aleut, says this was the only route to go to keep everything balanced.
We are in the middle of the Bering Sea, which is one of the biggest commercial fishing industries in the world. And it's going to take the work of all of us to come together and find a way to help the fur seals and at the same time not lock out our commercial fisheries. And I think the key point of a sanctuary and why we've chose this process is because it absolutely 100% keeps commercial fishing and the management authority into the Fishery Management Councils.
The initiative seeks to bring Unagan voices while addressing these issues. The proposal for the sanctuary has been submitted and is awaiting approval. Cartoon character Molly Maybray is inviting children to ring in the holidays with her. The PBS Kids Show launched a DIY holiday ornament activity on its website. The ornament includes Molly and her dog Suki. Children are able to print the ornament, color it, and then attach it to a light cardstock before hanging it on their tree. The template can be found at pbskids.org. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahant. Coming up, meet Richard Trudell, a Santee Dakota attorney, reflects on 40 years of defending Native nations. Plus, John Tahsuda's take on a tumultuous year in Washington. One of the untold stories in Indigenous communities is the amount of folks who are out doing work every day and just dedicating their careers to making life better for Indigenous people. Richard Trudell is one who's done just that, someone I admired over the years. He's a descendant of the Dakota who were exiled from Minnesota after the Dakota War of 1862. His ancestors were among those spared by President Abraham Lincoln. He attended various boarding schools and enlisted in the Navy during the Vietnam War. Richard Trudell founded the American Indian Lawyer Training Program and its companion, the American Indian Resources Institute. Welcome, Richard.
Same to you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You've had a really remarkable view of Indian country for the past really 4 decades. What stands out on that journey and where we're at now?
Well, I think the kind of progression of not only accomplishments, but just the progress that tribes have made. I think when I reflect on things, I tend to look at decades, what happened in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, going forward. And my involvement, I guess, I had no idea that I would ever attend law school. And when I did, and upon finishing law school, there were only a handful of Indian attorneys in the country. And most of them, or the half a dozen or more, were working in the federal government, primarily for the BIA. I mean, 2 that come to mind are Frank Duchesneau and Kurt Kickenberg, who were working at the Bureau, and then they moved on, or Frank did, over to the House of Representatives, the Natural Resources Committee, I guess. But it's been a pleasure just to watch Indian country evolve in terms of all the challenges they faced, and the progress they've made. And I was very fortunate to be able to witness some, amazing tribal leaders, because at that time, no one had anything. We didn't have the financial resources to do much. But as I said, in terms of reflecting on things decade by decade, I mean, when you look at the 50s from termination, moving into the 60s with the Great Society programs and what the Kennedy administration set in motion, and obviously President Johnson carried through, the creation of the Office of Economic Opportunity, which funded tribes directly as opposed to going through the BIA. You get into the 70s, and there was a tremendous amount of litigation that benefited tribes, as well as federal statutes such as the Self-Determination Act in the late 70s. You move to the 80s, and you look at what tribes were doing economically, and with the prosperity, coming from gaming, and the concerns that a lot of politicians and the private sector had about tribes and gaming. You move to the 90s, and it's really much more about governing, the responsibilities and the work that goes along with governing. And in that process, I've learned to really look at tribes both as the dual role they serve in terms of as governments and as entrepreneurs. And so I myself, being a lawyer, that was one of the first areas I looked at in terms of what I would call the Indian legal community, lawyers, people working in 4 tribal courts. And in fact, we didn't have anything. I mean, when I look back, when we started work dealing with tribal courts, we physically visited 100 reservations to see what their needs were and the status of their operations. At the time, the BI had a budget of $1 million nationally for the development of tribal courts in support of them. But fast forward today, I mean, it's just been amazing. I think we probably have in excess of 3,000 Indian attorneys, across the country, working for tribes, as well as a number of them working in Washington, D.C. I had the privilege of really being around people like Senator Inouye, Senator Kennedy, Senator Dodd, and had the good fortune of serving on the Legal Services Corporation Board with Hillary Clinton. We were appointed by President Carter. And the reason I mentioned that, it exposed me to the larger legal community on a national basis. And when Senator Inouye became the chair of the Indian Affairs Committee, he asked me through Patricia Zell to pull together a group of tribal leaders so he could hear them out in terms of what their needs, issues were, what should be in an Indian agenda. And we did that, and it was a remarkable kind of accident for me, so to speak, to be around the senator and to really get to know him, even though I never worked directly for him. But anytime he'd ask me to do something, I would not hesitate. But the leaders of his era were just amazing people. I don't know if we will ever see a public figure like Senator Inouye taking an interest in Indian affairs. I look at the current, political landscape, and obviously am not impressed with the lack of progress. Just with so many things that need to be done that aren't being done, and obviously a lot of this has been impacted by COVID. It's had a very disruptive impact on all communities, and especially tribal communities. So I've had a very good journey, and the older I get, the more I reflect or think about the challenges ahead for Indian country. And when I think of them, I think of 5 areas of concern in terms of being able to categorize some of the challenges. And the first area really being the assertion and exercise of tribal sovereignty and self-governance, how we go about that. And some tribes have done amazing jobs in terms of developing their governments. Secondly, you really think about cultural and social well-being. Concerns about languages, education, housing, what have you, all the social related issues. Third, when you really think about tribal homelands, what needs to be done to protect, to use, tribal homelands in a meaningful way. And fourth, to really, think about economic self-reliance and economic security. I think today's generation, and from my vantage point, I guess, in terms of from a history standpoint, is they're going to be measured by their ability to advance things economically. will future generations be better off than their generation? And obviously, with the pressures of population on a national basis, it will be challenging. The fourth or the last area that I always think about is really the development of tribal leaders, or the next generation of tribal leaders. Obviously, each generation faces different challenges and different tasks, and as well as dealing with unresolved challenges. But there are a host of things that future leaders are going to have to deal with that resemble what we've been through in the past. I constantly think of the water issues and the tribes' lack of resources, although they've done a much better job of really trying to develop the management capabilities. But when you look at the West in particular, with the Colorado River, the Colorado Basin, Columbia Basin, and then the Missouri Basin, there are some real major challenges. And obviously, without water, you don't do much. So it's been a real pleasure and honor for me to work for Indian country, to work with tribal leaders, and I really have enjoyed the past few decades. And it's amazing what the younger generations are doing, what you people are doing in terms of communication. I always thought that was kind of a missing piece, and I know you have devoted your career to working in a field of journalism, be it on the Navajo Reservation, Fort Hall, Seattle, Alaska, where have you. So I've really been impressed by your journey.
Thank you. It's funny. One of the things that struck me is when you were talking about the great leadership, particularly in the 1970s, is school kids are taught about the great chiefs from the 19th century, but the 20th century is just as rich with remarkable people, and that's not taught, even to our own people.
No, I would agree. I mean, I had the good fortune of being around people like Wendell Chino, Billy Frank, Mickey Pablo from Montana, Oren Lyons, from the Northeast. In all the meetings we did, it afforded me the opportunity and the luxury to move around Indian country, as well as, a number of my peers, such as Rick West, Patricia Zell, Alan Parker, Frank Duchesneau, and others who really made a mark in a very unselfish way. We're always looking for new things to do. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have any money, we didn't have any resources. So the bulk of the work we did was, just the love of the job, so to speak.
Well, we'll have to have this conversation again, because we could easily go on for another half hour.
No, I would agree. I know it's a lot to cover in a few minutes, but I think providing kind of a framework for discussion, and obviously there are a lot of other, people who've done a tremendous amount of work and have made a real difference. So, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share some thoughts with you, Mark.
Richard Trudell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll get a Washington update from John Tahsuda. We have a lot to discuss today with John Tahsuda III. He is a regular contributor to Indian Country Today. John was the staff director for the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and he is also former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. Today, he is a partner with Navigators Global, a company that provides political services to several industries, including tribes. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Mark.
So just like that, Build Back Better is probably no more.
Well, sometimes these things also just fall under the weight of their own immenseness. I mean, it was, immense legislation, and we really just a few months ago passed an immense infrastructure bill. So, sometimes it's just too much in one package. And I think, unfortunately, people perceived in these really challenging political times that there's not going to be a lot of separate bills, and they were hoping that a massive bill like this would be able to go through, and they would attach a lot of things to it. All these tax credits, et cetera, sometimes, those often go under separate tax bills and, revenue and spending bills. But those have been increasingly difficult in the last few years. And I think that, again, people were hoping that something like this would be a big enough train that could get everything in one shot, and not have to keep fighting over every specific piece of legislation.
So when you think about this bill and the tax credit, if you think about a young family on the reservation, that's a pretty big deal.
Right. Well, those will come to an end. Those are, interestingly enough, those things are often have broad support, and maybe that's a good example of something that could pass on its own, possibly, but it got hitched onto this really huge piece of legislation. And just couldn't make it through with that.
In fact, I think that's a really interesting point, because some of this legislation will have to come back simply because it's a part of the budget.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and so they'll I think even Senator Manchin, when he was saying no way, but alluded to the fact that there are things in here that have to get done. So they just have to break it apart. And, and they'll fight over the individual pieces, probably.
I want to ask you about the partisan nature of the fight. We saw on the infrastructure bill, a few Republicans join the majority. And on this one, you look at provisions, say, for Alaska Natives. There's some sweeteners in there for Republican senators from the state of Alaska.
Right. And this is the challenge that comes, from my time working on the Hill, senators, when they go to vote, when you have these larger bills and your legislation that you want are part of them, sometimes it backfires on you. You get the specific piece you wanted, but then there were all these other provisions that your supporters wanted you to oppose, and it all went forward together. And so then they just say, well, you just gave in. You let this other bad stuff go through, even if you got what you wanted, and they really get criticized for it, and that makes it really challenging for those senators.
Well, and this is one in Alaska, again, I'm thinking of Senator Murkowski, where she already is going to face a primary challenge. So at this point, what is there to lose in terms of finding the middle ground on these issues?
Well, so they redid their entire primary process, and they have this sort of jungle election primary now that's going to be really interesting. There's only a few places that do it that way, and I don't think any state actually, for statewide elections does it that way. So that'll be an interesting experiment just in voter participation, and to see how that goes. So I suspect that she has pretty broad support across different spectrums. When you slice them into parties and primaries, she may seem like she has less support, but if you add all those together, I think she's a pretty formidable candidate, just because of the breadth of her reach across all the different people that live in Alaska, the communities. She's obviously grown up there, a great name, et cetera. So.
And it is an extraordinary primary, because most of the time, as you say, the jungle primary is the top two. And in Alaska's case, it's the top four, which almost is something precisely written for Lisa Murkowski.
Well, there was some, rumors or thought that might be, in the writing of it was an eye towards the upcoming elections. But, the people supported it, fairly strongly. So.
We only have about a minute left, and we're ending the year. And I just want to have your take on kind of what kind of year it's been.
Wow. It's been a really, I think, strange and weird year. With the background of the pandemic seeming to just never end and get going on, that in some ways seems to have everybody on edge. And I think you've actually seen that in the politics in this country, and the politics being in, on the Hill, et cetera. people finding it a hard time to find common ground on things. So I'm hopeful that the year coming up, will lead to better things. I thought that the administration, President Biden, had his summit, even though it was virtual, but they laid out some things, and they have a lot of people in place now. So for the next couple of years, I expect to have more substantive stuff come out of them. But they've kind of laid the groundwork for that. So I thought they had, for Indian issues, I thought they had a pretty positive year for the administration, their first year in.
Well, and you look at just the appointment levels, whether it's in the judiciary or in the executive branch, that's pretty stunning.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And I think that, again, so hopefully that will lead to good results over the next few years. When you look at the judiciary, that's an interesting, that's an impact that will happen for years. I know it's only a couple of judges, but wow, it's more than we've ever had, so I think that's great.
Well, Happy New Year, John Tahsuda.
Happy New Year and Merry Christmas to you and everybody out in Indian country.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahant.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing rock. This is Indian Country Today.